Hi everyone, we are InteGRAL, which is Intersectional Gender Research, Advocacy and Learning. We are a gender research, we are a gender-focused research and consulting firm based in the Global South, specifically India and Indonesia. We take a gender lens to various issues, be it education, politics, labor force participation, health, peace and conflict, and so forth. And we're going to talk a little bit about our research that we did with Align in this short video. I'm joined by Penny and Risky, who are my co-founders, and we're going to talk about the research that we did with Align. So we conducted this research in India, and in India since the early 1990s, there has been an understanding that to reduce any kind of violence against women and girls, any kind of gender-based violence, there has to be a conversation with men, that they have to be involved. And since the early 1990s, there have been programs that have been working with men largely. However, in 2012, there was a rape case that happened in India called the Nirbhaya case, where a young woman was raped in a moving bus in the capital. And that incident jolted the country into action, into questions, because at that time, feminist activists, civil society organizations, youth, and just in general, like the general public was out on the streets asking the question that, we have curtailed women and girls quite a bit, but who is holding the boys accountable? And at that point, the government of India appointed the Justice Verma Commission, which is basically the role of the commission was to make suggestions to the government of India on how the violence against women and girls and other gender minorities can be reduced. And one of the suggestions of the Justice Verma Commission was to start young, start working with boys when they're still young. And therefore, from 2013, there has been a renewed focus on working with young men as well as boys. And so it has always been, the focus has always been to work with boys, but since 2013, the focus has just been renewed. And if I can give you just a slightly bigger picture, and of course, Rizky and Penny are going to talk a little more in depth, I can give you the bigger picture of what it is like in India. So in India, domestic violence is considered a private affair. It is not something that can be really spoken about. At the same time, marital rape is not criminalized. And you see this, but on the other side, the government has set up in various public hospitals, they have set up crisis intervention centers where women survivors, women victims of violence can come in and seek any kind of support and help. And what we see, therefore, is that this view is normalized, that women can be survivors, can be victims of violence, but men are rarely held accountable. And so, in the absence of these guardrails that protect women or hold men accountable, we need to, the onus is on us, on communities, organizations, educators to start working with men and young boys. And the idea then is that what we saw through our research, that can we start changing the conversation at the individual level and gradually change the discourse, which will then create an environment that allows for these laws and these larger structural changes to be made.
So our research found out that in shaping alternative masculinity with the aim to address violence against women and girls, the organization under the study have largely focused on acknowledging and identifying multiple types of violence. For example, there is one organization that worked with school-age boys and help them, educate them on identifying the various types of violence which may take place in the school environment. There is another organization that work with adult men and educate them on the various type of aggression and microaggressions around, for example, non-consensual or or romantic relationship, and discriminative societal norms around sexuality or gender identity. So from introducing these types of violence, this organization subsequently introduced the new visions of masculinity that steer away from the ideology of masculinity predicated around violence. We conclude that there are three main themes of alternative masculinity being introduced by the organization. The first one is the masculinity that rejects the idea of violence. It was conducted through a set of capacity building that enable men and boys to improve their knowledge and equip them with necessary language and self-confidence to communicate the problems of violence which exist in their personal life, so they can communicate that to their families, to their friends, and to the community around them. And we identified some example in the curriculum. For example, in one section of the curriculum, there is an attempt to challenge the strict adherence to the idea of heterosexuality, which might encourage everyday homophobic act. There is also another pedagogical practice which implement one single-sex learning space that enable boys to reflect on their experience of oppressive norm and stereotypes. That's the first theme. And the second theme, the alternative masculinity is equal to the positive contributions to the well-being of the family. So this kind of alternative masculinity was introduced through interrogating traditional norms that exist at home, which might subjugate women, children, or others, and make the home as the site of physical and sexual violence. For example, there is one organization that started informal saving scheme for fathers, and they educate these fathers on how to save money for household needs and for the education for their children, instead of spending the money for unnecessary expenses such as alcohol. So in this kind of practice, male adults are encouraged to play bigger role in domestic responsibility and in the betterment of the family. And the last theme that we found is the masculinity is equal to embracing different identities of others. On one particular sections of the curriculum, there is an attempt from the organization to engage with the concept of diversity, and this include diversity in terms of sexuality and gender identities. So, for example, if it's common, there are some cultural differences with respect to gender practice that were also being questioned in the classroom. For example, if it's common for men and boys to wear earring in Rajasthan, why it is not accepted in other regions? So there is some sense of acknowledgement of differences, and also the encouragement for individual to reflect on their experiences of being different. And this kind of pedagogical practice enable them to define masculinity in their own terms and question what was previously held as ideal or normal.
Yeah, so there are quite a few challenges when organizations are working with boys and men. And of course, it's much easier to work with younger boys as compared to older men. So one of the problems that the organizations shared was that it's very difficult to bring men together. It is often seen that if there is a group that's coming together, then it is generally a group of women in the case of a self-help group, or in the case of primary healthcare centers where you're teaching women to take care of their health or things like that. But it's very rare that men come together as a group. Of course, they play games, or they're sitting together chatting or discussing politics or village affairs or community affairs, but rarely do they come together. So it's very difficult to bring men together as a group. The second challenge is that when you look at the statistics, overwhelmingly the perpetrators of violence are men. And so, how do you run a program that does not shame or blame men, but instead engages them in a gainful way? In a gainful way, how do you make them vulnerable so that there is a honest discussion around these issues? The third challenge is that we've heard often is that feminism is a Western concept, that these Western ideas can actually create imbalance in the Indian society. The fourth challenge is definitely that whenever men and boys practice any new behaviors, there is a very strong backlash that comes in their, on their way. And that could be in terms of ostracization, or there could be bullying, there could be mockery. So, how do men who want to engage in these newer behaviors of alternative and positive masculinities, how do they actually do it? And the last challenge that we saw, that we actually came across, was that a lot of these programs are run by women. And so women are now shouldering the burden of, being potential victims or like survivors, and at the same time doing the job of reforming women, reforming men and reforming society. So the idea is that, how is it that, you're still somebody who's on the receiving end of the violence, and yet the burden is on you to now change society? So some of the effective approaches, what we saw, and we have just three of them, is that if you want to bring men and boys together, you use some kind of a pretext. So if you're bringing men together, one of the organizations, what they did was they started advocating with the men that they need to enroll for a government program that allows their children to gain admissions into private schools. It is a government it's a government benefit. And so a lot of the men started getting involved in their children's education, and as they got involved in their fatherly responsibilities, that's when they began to talk about these alternative and positive masculinities. In the other organization that we researched, the organization went into schools delivering comprehensive sexuality education, and then began to speak about masculinities and the role of violence in this definition of masculinities. The other one is, when people say that, feminism is a Western concept, the idea is that the program has to be rooted in the regional context, in the local context, and the local feminist history. And it is incredibly important to go back and look at the historical feminist struggles that have been taking place, and to draw on that to strengthen your masculinities program. And to how do you motivate men to stay strong in the face of backlash, is by creating a community. So how do these organizations create a community around these newer learnings and newer behaviors? So one of the organizations is actively setting up an alumni group. They're in the process of creating an alumni group where they can talk about these issues. It is an online alumni group. In a village that we went to where we were doing this research, what we saw is that it's a very tight knit and close knit community. And so, how does everyone come together and support each other to practice these behaviors?
From our research as well as from our experience, we can highlight the four key main messages. The first one is it's important for us to identify some of the common areas during boyhood to manhood that encourage violence. This includes marriage or with our romantic partner, or through movies or occupations and other examples that might encourage violence, and address them, but also identify existing and potential positive experiences of a more gender sensitive and equal practices between genders, including finding role models for alternative masculinity. And the second one is, as mentioned by Fiona and Penny as well, it's important to use a pretext to bring men and boys together. In our study, we found that organizations use an informal ways to engage men. For example, using the saving scheme that can make them more aware or open conversations about taking care of families or economic households. And in another example, also a comprehensive sexuality education was used to start talking about violent masculinities. This include specifically for boys. And the third one is we also felt that the use of a single sex learning spaces helped to create an environment of discussion rather than a debate. So they create a learning space where they feel comfortable in engaging a little bit of controversial or investigating their ideas about masculinities and their exposure to violent masculinities, and how we can find uh, or ways to allow the community, which can be key when it comes to practicing newer behavior, contrary to a more violent or traditional norms that encourage male privilege against other genders. And the fourth one is it's crucial to impart the learning space with connecting it to other feminist struggles and existing collective efforts and alliances between diverse religion, gender, class, ethnicity, among others, and also to bridge the individual approach or small group approach with a more structural outlook with social, cultural, economic, and political horizon. So in this way, they can map their position within the social hierarchy and finding ways how they and us could strategize our pedagogy or their pedagogy within a wider movement. That's the four key messages.
There are some takeaways that we can extract from our finding in this research. Is that in India, where this research was conducted, there is quite limited understanding of what comprises of violence. So, for example, the domestic violence and marital rape are widely not considered as a crime, and therefore it is not considered as a public health crisis. And as the result, it has implications on the lack of institutional support that to ensure that if this kind of violence can cease to exist. And this also has implication on the role of the informal network, grassroots community, also add their pressures to address this kind of violence when there is no institutional support available to address this. And secondly, I think the distinct characteristic of violence in the South Asian context is that there is a huge role of cultural productions of Bollywood movies, which are widely consumed not only by Indian society, I guess, but also by other countries in Asia. For example, in Indonesia, we also consume the the Bollywood movies. And the problem with this Bollywood movie is that they depict male personality that distribute the desired masculine attribute, and which are largely taken from the representations of upper class, sometimes from powerful figure, and most of the time physically strong Hindus. And this popular cinema in India has provided a very rich cultural text for us to understand gender ideology and gender relations that have long sanctions power to men and assert masculine dominant over women in Indian society. And lastly, I think the last characteristic which we can learn is that in this research, we are using the theory of continuum violence by Cynthia Cockburn, and she highlighted that violence exists in society and may transcend across various spaces, generation, and times. So the construction of Hindu masculinity in India, which are perpetuated by media and by the political leaders, might breed a culture of male privilege, male superiority, and virility that influence gender practice not only in the public but also when it encounters the everyday life of Indian society. Uh, it informed the very how the very foundations of reality of within the structure of Indian family and Indian society. And I guess how it is manifested in everyday lives in Indian society, Fiona can give some example about that.
Thanks, Penny, for that. And in fact, I'll just talk about very quickly two examples. So, in one of our research participants was a fairly young man, and he had finished his graduation. He had finished his studies. He had an advanced degree, and he said that he had applied for an entry level sales job. But eventually, he did not get this job because he believes that it went to the wealthier counterparts. And at that point, he was forced to purchase an auto rickshaw and become an auto rickshaw driver. And I guess what I was reflecting on, in fact, when he was talking about it, is that the violence that is embedded in his experience, the sort of the violence of a broken dream. At the same time, um, the being an auto rickshaw driver does not give you any kind of social security, and also there is an inherent competitiveness because you want to get the best custom from your other auto rickshaw driver peers, and then there is road rage. So it's not that we are condoning this kind of violence that a man might eventually come and perpetrate on probably the women in his household, the women and children in his household. But the idea is that we need to take a larger systemic view of where this violence is coming from, and can there be certain structures put in place that protect and prevent even men, so that this violence is not perpetrated. And the second example, taking from Penny's reflection on Bollywood, if you look around today, the kind of movies that are being made are extremely nationalistic in their message, in order to appease a highly Hindu nationalistic and Islamophobic government. And so, along with a prime minister who's presented as a very virile, very strong, a strong man. And so, if you see, like, the conversation in India is all around this sort of a Hindu virility, Hindu men that are, ready to fight largely the others, which are basically Muslims in India as well as Muslims outside, which is Pakistan. And so I think that this violence has permeated our everyday language, and men are therefore goaded to adopt this violence in their everyday life. And I think it's extremely important to take a larger view of where this is coming from. A lot of these organizations have not undertaken an impact study because a lot of them do not have the kind of budget to do an evaluation of how effective their programs are. But when we were speaking to the participants, especially one of the fathers, I remember when he came in to speak to us, he did talk about what, in fact, in that organization, we could clearly see that there was a vocabulary of tenderness, of care, and, protection and love, which is something that is not normal when you talk to men in general. And I think that this adoption of this vocabulary of love and care came in because of the work that the organization was doing to reform this masculinity. So that was one example, in the sense for us to see that yes, this program is actually working. The other was when we went to speak to young men from another program that was being conducted. They had an absolutely clear conviction that the gender is not binary, that there are it is basically a spectrum, and people can be whoever they want to be. at the same time, there was this inherent understanding that we cannot just read somebody's name and assume that they are a man or a woman. They could be anyone. And I think this these kind of conversations were repeated, and in so many ways we felt like it was evident that these programs were having an effect on the way in which men and boys were looking at the world and differences.
One of the organizations in their annual report actually said that they are invited by the local government, and I think even by the national government, to discuss about the more gender sensitive policies in terms of their performance in the local level. So I think it's one of the achievement that these organizations, although they're working in the local or grassroots organizations with more like a small individual approach in terms of alternative masculinity, they actually acknowledge as well by the policymakers. So I think that's one of the impact of their efforts as well.